Thank you all for being here, for your continued support of the CTO and of the work of the organization. We once again have had, up to this point, an incredibly successful event, and I'm going to pass the microphone immediately over to the Chairman of the Council of Ministers, the Honourable Richard Seeley, who is going to tell you a little bit about the state of the industry, after which we will invite you to ask whatever questions you might have.
Thank you, Johnson. Thank you, Secretary General. Host, Minister Stanley Pham, President of the partner organization, the CHTA, immediately, and of course Frank, the CEO, Frank Comito, other officials, distinguished members of the media. I, of course, start this by thanking Minister Stanley Pham and his team. I just plan to make a very brief statement because I know you have several questions, and maybe in covering some of these facts. International tourist arrivals to the Caribbean continue to be strong. We have seen a 5.8% increase through to the first half of the year through June, and we're outpacing all other major regions of the world. You would have heard Carlos Vogel make that point as well, who's from the United Nations World Tourism Organization. More specifically, for the first 6 months, the Caribbean welcomed 14.8 million visitors, approximately 800,000, or 5.8% higher than for the corresponding period in 2014, and well above the 4.1% that has been recorded globally. The Caribbean share of global arrivals stood at a modest 2.8%. The Dutch Caribbean actually saw the fastest growth relative to all of the other sub-regions, and in the first 6 months of 2015, we actually saw 8.5% increase in arrivals. This is in the Dutch Caribbean. All of the destinations in the sub-region had considerable growth, benefiting from increased demand from the US and South American markets. The data we've obtained from our members shows that the US remains our main market, with 7.3 million visitors between January and June, and this, of course, is a 5.3% increase. The Canadian market continues to perform well, with 2.1 million visits during the period, while arrivals from Europe increased by 1.1%, moving from 2.58 million in 2014 to 2.61 in 2015. The intra-regional market recorded strong growth of 5.5%, with some 400,000 visits. The overall information that we can extract from that is that while we are seeing growth, there is still tremendous potential to be realized for the Caribbean region, and we at the CTO, of course, are committed to seeing that we can realize that potential, particularly from the intra-regional end, and of course Europe, where we've only seen some modest increases. Hotel performance, of course, the indicators which are used to monitor the performance of the accommodation sector were positive and holding strong through to the end of June. Room occupancy in the first half of the year stood at 74.6%, up from the 72% during the same period of 2014. Both room rates and revenue increased during the period, with room revenue collected in the sector rising 9.2%. The available room stock across the region also increased by 1.5%. Again, going in the right direction, but clearly still some upside, still some potential, and that's a very good sign for tourism. The cruise picture is also a positive one. Cruising to the Caribbean continued to be in high demand up to the end of June. There were an estimating 13.7 million cruise passenger visits to the region in the first 6 months, an overall 3% rise over the corresponding period last year. The numbers suggest that the prospects for Caribbean tourism are good, and we remain optimistic, even if merely cautiously so. And we maintain the pace during the second half of the year. Overall, the CTO's research department is saying that we should see a 5 to 6% growth this year. That, of course, over a record year. So we are talking about a new benchmark being set for 2015 for Caribbean tourism. Permit me now to speak specifically about the SOTIC conference this year and how it has gone so far. We've had more coverage on social media than at any other time, thanks to many of you in this room, actually, who have done an outstanding job of sharing news, information, and the wonderful time that you're having here in Curacao. Minister Pam, I'm sure, will be happy to hear that. Let me, of course, on behalf of the CTO, and thank you for your support. The keynote address, of course, by Mr. Robin Hayes generated quite some stories from you, for you, so you must have been pleased. We are happy, of course, with the announcements made by the JetBlue CEO about additional services to the region. This is just one of the many positives coming out of this conference so far. It was heartening to hear, of course, the testimony. For me, one of the high points, as I'm sure it would have been for many of you in this room, was to hear the very eloquent testimony from a CTO Foundation Scholarship recipient during lunch yesterday, as she explained what it meant for her and the impact that that scholarship has had on her life. She is now, of course, functioning as the Chief Operating Officer of the St. Vincent and Grenadines Tourism Authority since completing her studies. It is a simple example, but it shows the CTO commitment and the work of the organization does to ensure that the country's future is secure by working with and developing our youth. And this to us is what sustainability is all about. We, of course, learned during our business meetings that almost 600 students in the Caribbean taking tourism subjects at the advanced levels. This is through the Caribbean Examinations Council. The CTO advocated, engaged, and sometimes pleaded for the teaching of tourism in our schools. It was a long road. It took a long time, but it is finally happening. And we are proud that we played a part. And of course, we look forward to seeing that that 600 becomes 6,000 and even grows from there. As we work to serve our members in the best way possible, our Research and Information Technology Department is currently working on a tool which would help our members identify their best possible prospects. The acting head of Research and IT, Ryan Skeet, is here and of course will be available to provide you with some details. Before I end, of course, I have to also thank the two leaders who accepted a letter from the CTO committing them to be champions for tourism. Premier Rufus Ewing of the Turks and Caicos Islands and the leader of government business in St. Eustatius. They are trailblazers in this regard. I might add, both of those gentlemen were ministers of tourism in previous incarnations as well. And we look forward to the other leaders as well, also making a similar commitment to the primary revenue earner for the regions. I want to once again thank all of you for coming out, and I would like to invite Minister Stanley Pam as well, our host, to share a few words. It's up to you, sir, if you wish to come to the lectern. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman, Mr. Seeley. Indeed, like Minister Seeley said, so far it's been a good conference. I mean, for us, specifically for the island of Curacao, it was a very positive, very good announcement that the CEO of JetBlue made that we're getting a third flight, but also for the region itself, for all the other islands. And it was very interesting to see the developments and the plans that JetBlue has for the region. And we can truly consider JetBlue as a partner of the region. The SOTIC itself, I must say that we are very pleased with the attendance. We have had a lot of people coming in from different countries, even though we do have limited connectivity by air. I know everybody had to come from either Miami or St. Martin or Trinidad and Tobago. We are united by land, by sea, sorry, we are united by sea, and the air connectivity is sometimes quite difficult, especially if we're this south of the Caribbean region. But the only thing I can say now is I'd like to thank the organization, the CTO staff, the whole staff for having a wonderful organization of this event. And of course, the local team also that has been working day and night to make this possible so all of you can feel at home here in Curacao. And of course, the media also, the tour operators, everybody that is here that's having a wonderful time. So we're very pleased, very happy to have been hosting this event. And we still have one more day left, and tonight there will be a closing reception. So we're very pleased and very happy with the conference. Thank you.
Mr. Vogel made a statement yesterday about us losing share, and my question is to the chairman. Can you explain to me, with all of the positives that you just mentioned and the increases that we've been seeing, how is it that we're losing market share?
Okay, I believe you didn't quite get Mr. Vogler's statement correct. It's not that we, yeah, and he didn't say we are losing share.
Market share.
No, he didn't say that at all. I think what he said, oh, I'm sorry. I think the point that he made is that we are not growing as fast as some of the other regions. What's happening is that the number of outbound tourists is growing globally, and there are some regions that are growing faster than the Caribbean. That's the point that he made. And I mean, let's face it, many of these regions are not necessarily as mature as the Caribbean is. So we are probably more at an optimal point. So if you're coming from 0 and you go to 10, that's 100% increase. So I'm just saying other regions would be growing faster because they're sort of emerging new destinations, etc. The point that I think certainly Mr. Vogel made, and the point that I made this morning, is that even though we are seeing increases, we recognize that in some instances they're modest, and therefore there is still a lot of upside. There's still a lot of potential for growth in the Caribbean. And I think that is the point that we have to extract from where we are right now in terms of tourism as a region.
So I think the question remains, what is to be done now? So our next question, takes it a little further. Other areas are growing faster than the Caribbean, and the point is taking older, mature destination there, but we can't live on that. What are we going to do now going forward?
Oh, okay. Well, that is where, I mean, there's no one answer to that per se. What we have to do is to renew and rejuvenate ourselves. We have to make our stories more compelling. We have to accept that, 30, 40, for that matter, even 20 years ago, competition was different. The concept of a warm weather island vacation, the world has options now that probably didn't have before. I mean, we all know what's going on in the Pacific, on both sides of the Pacific, and we have to constantly recognize that we need to compete. I think the mere fact that we are still attracting investment, we are still seeing some growth. There are still some markets where we are seeing modest increases. For example, the European market, you heard me mention that our growth is quite modest, and we have to sort of look to these areas and, of course, look to new markets. There's all sorts of potential coming out of Asia and Latin America. And I think that that is one of the things that we need to do. And I know the CTO has certainly been at the vanguard of this effort. Our members have traditionally tended to focus on 2 or 3 major source markets, but that has to change if we are really going to continue to be big players in this tourism sector. Carlos, you wanted to say something?
The point I wanted to make yesterday is that the Caribbean, as a sub-region within the Americas, has a relatively low market share globally compared to the important dependence that it has in its economies of tourism. Now, it is growing actually at a faster speed than the overall average. I mean, last year there was an average growth of international arrivals worldwide 4.3%, and the Caribbean grew about 6%. So the pace of growth is very healthy, but still the overall market share remains low. Now, let's look at the reasons for that. The sub-region in the world that is experiencing the highest growth speed is Southeast Asia. And you would easily understand the reason for that. They have a very important source market next to them, which is China. And it's a market which is growing and emerging. It grew nearly 30%, its outbound capacity last year. Year to date, it's growing in the pace of 48%. So Southeast Asia benefits from that. Let's put ourselves in the Caribbean. Which is your most important source market? It's a mature market that doesn't have the room for growth like the US and the Chinese market has. So that is the reason why it is very difficult for the Caribbean to grow at the same speed that Southeast Asia receptive inbound countries are growing. So because sometimes, you know, when we play with the numbers, it's difficult to get the right interpretation. But that is the point I wanted to make, and probably I wasn't clear enough yesterday. Thank you.
Tony?
Can I ask the Rotarian to give your input into this requirement for advancing the market share of the Caribbean? In other words, the CTO and the governments and the agencies probably are doing and probably can do more. But what about the Rotarians? What are they doing in this effort?
I believe that overall the entire region, both public and private sector, has a lot of room for growth. I think that the approach that CHTA has taken in its reinventing itself is very much geared towards helping the private sector to become more efficient, both on the operational side as well as on a marketing side. So this change in philosophy in our association really centers around our association becoming a facilitator, a curator of best and worst practices for private sector. Meaning that lessons learned by member hotels, member countries are now centralized with CHTA and redistributed to all the others throughout the Caribbean. So, you know, to your point, I think that there is now a very systematic approach to helping the industry help itself to improve, to become more profitable and to be more competitive. And I think that that same model could very easily apply to the ministerial government side as well, that, you know, sharing lessons learned between ourselves is a great way. CTO, I attended a conference a couple months ago in Barbados where we were studying the Singapore model. The Caribbean being the most tourism-dependent region in the world, other people should be studying the Caribbean model. We should be the innovators. We should be the biggest. Since we are the most dependent region on tourism, we should be the most innovative and the biggest risk takers in terms of growing our industry.
So that is, sorry, but That's a kind of abstraction.
Yes.
What in practical terms does that all mean?
Well, I mean, to give you a practical example, we have an event in January, the Caribbean Marketplace, and we're very much focused on evolving the event into how do I grow revenue. So adding to our traditional tour operator and hotel event, which is a critical part of all of our businesses, but we want to help our members to become better marketers. So for example, we will have specific educational seminars there about what should my website look like, how do I improve traffic to my website, how do I manage my different rates and channels in the marketplace, what kind of conversion rate is an appropriate conversion rate, and can I benchmark that against other people so that I can get an idea, am I performing well or not, and if I'm not, I'm going to connect you with resources that's going to specifically tell you how do I get my conversion rate up. So we are looking at very much that granular hands-on training for our members, because we realize that there is a whole range throughout the Caribbean, that there's people who've ended up in the tourism business sideways who just sort of, and then there's there's chains and very professional people, and we're trying to service everyone and share that knowledge between all of our members.
Okay.
Hi, Eleanor Harley, Turbo News, a tourism executive. There's been a lot of conversation about the numbers of people visiting the destinations, but can you tell me how much the average spend is and what markets are spending the most and staying the longest?
First of all, last year, the overall spend was about $30 billion in the Caribbean, which resulted from those 26 million visitors that we had.
That was a record.
Specific
that was
markets and how much they're spending.
Yeah, we'll have a breakdown for you, which I confess that I haven't memorized, but we will give you that detail. The important factor, though, and this is perhaps where you're going, is that there are several metrics by which we assess the performance of tourism. Arrivals is one, and because the first order of business is to get people to come to our region, but we are very pleased to see that the spend, the average room rate, the revenue per available room, those metrics are going in the right direction. I think we all realized what happened when the recession hit. There was this lag between arrivals and actual spend. The questioner, I think, is asking, can we demonstrate how we are now closing that gap? In a recession, the Caribbean, like every other business, has to do all kinds of interesting things about dropping your rates and so on to stay competitive. That position has improved, and to answer your question specifically about which markets are doing better in terms of the spend and the average stay and so on, that's information that I know that we can make available to you in very granular detail through the CHDA and the CHDO. Well, revenue per available room is one of the clearest metrics.
But what part of this is visiting friends and family? How many people are here in some of the islands for medical treatment? What are your specific target markets in terms of growing your sectors?
All right, let me just lots of questions there. So you realize that, well, the chairman hit the nail on the head in several different places during his comments. So let me just go back to this whole market segment question. So one of the things that the chairman said in his comments was that the CTO is using market segmentation tools to very specifically understand who the people are that are coming to our countries, where they're coming from, what their characteristics are, what their spending habits are, what their how they consume their media. The more we know about the people who come to our member countries, the more we're able to target more people who are just like them, the more we're able to use them also as brand champions and brand ambassadors. Some of these people give us their time and their money by coming several times during the course of their lifetime. Some of them visit the Caribbean 25 and more times. If we start really targeting on who our best possible customers are, then to Tony Fraser's question and other questioners, we are then able to find people who have those same characteristics wherever they are in the world. So if Minister Palm says to the CTO, okay, now that I know what the profile is through this segmentation tool that we're using, I want you to find some of those people for us. Tell us where they are in the new gateways that JetBlue might be flying from. Tell us where to find these best possible customers for Curacao. And they look different from the best possible customers for Barbados or our other member countries. So once we can find them, we are using a very simple principle. We know that we have data already, just mine that data properly and see how we can expand it. Somebody was asking earlier, well, let me stay with Eleanor's question then. Eleanor is asking about segmentation from a different point of view. She started to ask about medical tourism. She started to ask about the value of the diaspora and so on. There's a lot of work being done on all those areas, more in some countries than others, because the diaspora of St. Eustatius is significantly smaller than the diaspora of Jamaica. And so there are plans that our member countries have that fit their particular model of tourism, and all of those segments are being addressed. So I don't have the specific details for you about the number that's being generated by medical tourism or any specific segment in front of me, but to the extent that we have those kinds of details available, we will make them. They'll put them at your disposal.
Yeah, so
I'm Darlene Hodge from the Daily Herald in Samaritan, the French newspaper. Yesterday we were talking about Open Skies Agreement, so I was wondering if you could summarize just basically, what are the bottlenecks, what are the limitations, what is the timeline, is it likely, are some countries more eager than others in the region as a whole?
The whole notion of providing an environment in which airlines that are certified and registered to do business in the Caribbean can then operate with several freedoms throughout the rest of the region is a topic that continues to be discussed in some detail, and progress is being made. So when you come to a session later today on facilitation, I believe you're going to see what progress has been made in those areas. Recognizing the fact that we have several jurisdictions throughout the Caribbean, this helps to explain why it's not always as simple as it sounds. So we have independent sovereign countries and non-independent countries, and we have some countries that are French and Dutch and Spanish and English, and some interact with various jurisdictions to get their marching orders, as it were. So doing bilateral arrangements and multilateral arrangements creates a fairly complex maze of operations. So when you come to the facilitation session today, you will hear from one of our partners, IATA, about some of the work that we have been doing to facilitate the movement of people into and around the Caribbean. We've broken it down into four different categories of work that we have to do to make all of this happen. And I'm very pleased to see that we are making progress. Without preempting anything, well, actually, here in Curacao, I believe that you saw recently an announcement about the expansion of Insel Air and JetBlue. I know that you heard also, or I hope you did, from David Evans, the CEO of LIAT, about some of the things that they're doing with their route system as well. So the whole business of facilitating travel around the Caribbean is clearly not a one-size-fits-all operation, but we're making progress as we go along. And I know the chairman will want me to remind you that one of the main catalysts for that kind of change is the CTO's Aviation Task Force. That task force has been focused on breaking down the issues, regulatory issues, the legal and regulatory issues involved, safety and security issues involved that have to do with border control, the economics of travel, and the whole business of the travel experience. So travel facilitation has been something that we paid a lot of attention to, and I'm very pleased to say that at this conference, so far, you've seen what progress has been made because those announcements are now public, and more of that will be discussed at travel facilitation during the course of this morning.
I know it may not be the direct responsibility of CTO with regard to dealing with the criminal element in the region. A couple of days ago, there was yet another example of that kind of thing in Tobago, and not for the first time. And there was, the British put out some kind of travel advisory and so on. CARICOM has, at the level of CARICOM, has an overarching responsibility. I think it's with the Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago now, regarding security in the region. But you must be getting very concerned about this matter and what can be done at a regional level, especially with regard to the tourism.
Well, first of all, Tony, let me take this opportunity to express sympathy to the family of the couple, the victim in Tobago that you referred. It's a very unfortunate occurrence. I still, one incident like that is one incident too many. We don't like when these things happen, but we know a few things. That is that in the majority of instances, these things are solved very quickly. And we also know that the Caribbean collectively as a region is still an extremely safe place to visit. Crime is extremely low against visitors in the Caribbean region. And I think that we shouldn't lose sight of that. But that is not in any way to take away from these occurrences that happen. They will happen, but we are sorry when they happen. But I can say that we are still, we're not crime free, but the incidence of crime is still extremely low.
Does it alarm you sufficiently to make an overture on behalf of the tourism industry, and when I say you, I mean the industry, to the governments to say, look, this thing is impacting on us?
Well, certainly. Again, we are ministers of tourism, all sit in the cabinet of their respective countries. Usually a minister of national security or a minister of home affairs or an attorney general, or sometimes one person in all those offices under one person sits there, and we do our part. There are some jurisdictions, including this one where we are now, Curacao, where there's something called tourism police. I mean, there are different mechanisms and means, but I think that I stand by my assessment that again the crime is still very, very low against visitors in the region. It is unfortunate what occurred in Tobago, and I certainly commiserated with Minister Cujo and the people from Trinidad and Tobago. I've had to deal with it in Barbados, and in the last 8 years as minister hasn't been crime free either. But again, we have to confront these issues. We're not afraid to confront them, but at the same time, we know that it is a rarity, and we have to do all to see that it continues to remain that way.
Friends, colleagues, thank you very, very much.